Welcome to our webinar titled Living with Pediatric Bone Marrow Failure Disease, a Pediatric Parent Panel. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lee Clark, patient educator, and I'll be moderating the presentation today. As we get started, I'd like to recognize the generous support of our corporate sponsors and the generous support of our patients, families, and caregivers for supporting the program today. Due to the high volume of teleconferences on the internet, it is possible you may lose your connection during the program. If you are unable to view the webinar online, you can call in to hear the audio portion of our program using the call-in number in your reminder email. Today's program will be archived to our website within 2 to 3 business days. You will be notified by email when it is live and ready for viewing. During the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions at any time. To submit a question or comment, open the Q&A window in the lower part of your screen. Type your question in the small text box window, and when you have finished typing, just hit enter. We will do our best to get to everyone's questions today. When asking questions, I do ask that you do 2 things to help me manage the incoming questions. First, submit your entire question all at the same time. Second, please do not share private health information in your question. Our panelists today are not medical experts and will not be able to answer specific questions related to your health care. Our specialists today, we have Jennifer and Christy, and they'll be today talking about their family's experiences living with bone marrow failure diseases. So thank you so much, Jennifer and Christy, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So to get started, tell us about your family's experience and what led to your children being diagnosed with a bone marrow failure disease. Jennifer, would you like to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So my son was 13 when he was diagnosed, and actually we just went for a routine physical. My son was extremely active, was playing soccer, lacrosse, basketball, all at the same time. He was bruising, but every time I mentioned it to the doctor, they said, oh, it's explainable because he would have cleat marks or stick marks from the lacrosse stick. So we were told not to be alarmed. So we did go for an annual physical, and I was told that he needs to come back in for blood work because the blood levels came back abnormal. So just did that, thinking nothing of it, because the doctor thought for sure it was a lab error. And to find out at that moment, the numbers continued to drop. So from there, he was sent to a hematologist to be looked at. And the hematologist honestly was kind of shocked because they said he looked fine on the outside, but the blood showed a different story. So he monitored him for a little while, sent him for a couple of bone marrow biopsies, and that's how we learned of his diagnosis of pediatric myelodysplastic syndrome.
Thank you. Christy?
I'm Christy. My daughter was diagnosed with severe aplastic anemia when she was 5 years old. And like Jennifer, bruising was kind of the first obvious sign. And I had also asked the pediatrician, and they thought it was somewhat normal schoolyard play, and things just kept getting worse. And one night she woke up with a bloody nose in the middle of the night that lasted for an hour and a half and was massive. And so we, did some more digging and went to National Jewish for her asthma and allergies. And they had thought, they always do blood work. So they took a closer look at it and said, if it isn't allergies or asthma, we can't do anything, obviously, but we're doing a blood draw, we'll take a closer look. And we got a phone call that evening saying it's not emergent, but it is urgent. You get with your pediatrician. So we immediately got with the pediatrician, who 2 hours later called and said, we think your child has leukemia. You need to go to Children's Hospital. and that got the ball rolling. It took several weeks to determine that it was actually aplastic anemia and not leukemia. And obviously they couldn't treat until they knew what it was they were treating. So we ended up going through ATG as the first round of treatment, which did not work for us, was not successful for my daughter. We were fortunate enough to have a sibling match and ended up going through a bone marrow transplant that was successful.
Thank you. What were you initially told about your child's diagnosis? Christy, what did they tell you? What is aplastic anemia?
That it was a bone marrow failure disease and the head hematologist was out. So they wanted to wait until she returned, but they were able to say your daughter's blood levels are not adequate because her bone marrow is no longer producing viable blood cells. Her immune system has turned on itself and is now attacking newborn blood cells, resulting in lower and lower levels of every kind of blood cell. So when we first got to Children's Hospital, she needed a platelet transplant. And so we had a crash course in the difference of the three types of blood cells, the platelets for the clotting, the white cells for the immune, and the red cells for energy and oxygen. She had a platelet transplant. It was Christmas Eve that we got discharged from the hospital. So we were told we could go to my mother's house because it was in town. We couldn't go home because we lived over an hour from the hospital, and to watch her closely because her platelets, despite having a transfusion, were still going to be chronically low and she could then bleed out, and to return immediately after the holiday.
Thank you. Jennifer, what were you told about what is myelodysplastic syndromes?
Well, I mean, honestly, when I was told that, I was trying to Google it at the same exact time because I had never heard of that and didn't even know how to spell it. I was told that it was pre-leukemia and that it wasn't a question of if my son would get acute myeloid leukemia, AML, but it was a question of when, that he needed a bone marrow transplant immediately. And right away, they asked if I had any other children. I did have a daughter, a younger daughter, his younger sister, and that they were going to test her to see if she would be a suitable match for him because that was his best chance. Extremely overwhelmed. I just remember just sitting there listening to everything the doctor was telling me. And my question to him was, well, what do you mean if, or when? I didn't really believe him, to be honest with you. So I did go home and Googled, spend more time looking at pediatric myelodysplastic syndrome, because that was very hard to find. And found that is how we found Dr. Hoffman. My son was treated at Boston Children's Hospital and really wanted to know more information because I was pretty much told that a bone marrow transplant was a harsh treatment and that he would be in and out of the hospital for a year. This was our original information given to us when we were told. And to me, it wasn't something I really wanted to put him through if he wasn't going to get leukemia. Again, I didn't know much about MDS, but Dr. Hoffman explained it to me very well and said that basically his blood was like a garden and these weeds were attacking his blood cells and not allowing them to grow because his counts were just dropping very quickly. And his platelets were one of the things that were dropping the fastest, and then the white blood cell counts. And she says, so basically we need to take out all the weeds, all the bad cells, and start over, refertilize. That would be the transplant. And then again, put in the new cells and let them grow healthy without being choked out. So her explanation honestly sold me right away, like, well, this is where we're going to get him treated, just because I felt peaceful. She was explaining in ways that we understood. And my son was very involved. He was 13 at the time. So he was involved in all the care, wanted to be in all the meetings. He didn't like initially, the first doctor that we went to, they didn't involve him. They always called us in first and had him wait. It upset him a lot. And they involved him. She involved him and allowed him to hear what was happening. But she spoke it in a way that a 13-year-old boy can understand, as well as watch his reactions as well as ours. And if it was too much information, they would stop because we were there all day pretty much. They would just, let's take a 30-minute break and they would come back. and share more information.
Well, Jennifer, you answered mine. The next question was, after your diagnosis, did you consider or did you get a second opinion before moving forward with treatment? So, Jennifer, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Yes, absolutely. We got a second opinion because I remember my husband and I just staring at each other what just happened? This child was fine, and here we are. So yes, without a doubt, we got a second opinion because to go through a bone marrow transplant, in my opinion, without really confirming, it is hard for a parent to decide. So we actually had an appointment with a different doctor for a second opinion, but after more Googling, again, like I said, I came across Dr. Hoffman, and we called over at Boston Children's Hospital to just see if we can get an appointment for a second opinion. And what I did like is that they answered some of our questions right over the phone without, they asked very specific questions, I should say, and then answer our questions right away. Like, pretty much this looks like the direction you're going to, but yes, they put us in for a second opinion right away. And in determining where that second opinion was going to come from, I did do research on successful bone marrow transplants for specifically myelodysplastic syndrome, because I figured if they were going to confirm his diagnosis, I kind of want to be with somebody that I know I think we can kind of maybe further that care. I didn't want somebody just saying, yes, that's what it is. I wanted to know, what do we do from here? And I wanted to make sure he had that best possible chance to have a successful transplant, recover, and live a long life after, healthy.
Thank you, Jennifer. Christy, how about you? Did you guys consider a second opinion?
Yes and no, because when we went to Children's, they were doing so many tests to determine what it was that our daughter had. So they were sending her blood work all over the country. So we felt like by the time we made a decision on treatment, we had had dozens of eyes on it. It had gone to the Mayo Clinic. It had gone to Children's in Boston. So we felt comfortable when they finally diagnosed her with aplastic anemia moving forward. And the one bit of information a doctor gave us right off the bat was to not do any research other than aamds.com. And so I can relate to feeling overwhelmed, Jennifer, for sure. And so we went there, and everything that was on your website aligned with what we were being told. And again, because it's such a rare disease, there's not a plethora of information out there at your fingertips. There aren't other people you can reach out to and have this conversation and compare notes as to what did you do. So when we were presented with her diagnosis is severe aplastic anemia. There are 3 categories of aplastic anemia, severe aplastic anemia, or very severe aplastic anemia. We had fallen right in the middle category. They had done a DNA test on my husband and I and our younger daughter, and we immediately found out that our younger daughter, who was 2 at the time, was a match. And it wasn't something we could possibly entertain at the time. Like a bone marrow transplant. What is a bone marrow transplant? Like, in all the terms we had heard, the only one we were familiar with the word, not even the diagnosis, was leukemia. And now we're learning all of this new stuff in bone marrow transplant. We couldn't allow ourselves to go there. So we opted for the ATG treatment. And, they started her as soon as they could. It was about 6 weeks after our initial visit to Children's. And then we had to wait 3 months to see what the results were. And when we found out that the results were not promising for her, then we decided to go with bone marrow transplant, and again, didn't get a second opinion on it. It was, for us, the only option.
Thank you. And this question is for Jennifer. With pediatric MDS being more rare than rare of a rare disease, Were there any other options offered to you besides a bone marrow transplant for pediatric MDS?
Yeah, that's a good question because that was my question. And we were told no. Because of, I mean, I will share that he did have monosomy 7 along with the myelodysplastic syndrome. So I guess the combination of those two, I was told, again, it was just a question of when he would get AML. And with his situation, if it progressed to AML, we were told the prognosis would not be favorable. So it was our only option. It was a struggle. To sign the paperwork just because of all the risks associated with it. And again, to us, our son looked healthy. So we're really relying on these numbers that are coming through all these blood works and biopsies and things I had never knew before, honestly. I mean, now I could read a lab report, but back then it's like, what am I looking at? So we were told for him to live, that's what we have to do. So I remember asking the very specific question before I signed the last piece of paper. Do you think he will survive? Because my struggle at the time was, he's happy. Why am I going to put him through all this if it's not going to go well? Where he's at least happy now and he can run, he can do things. And we did see him start declining at this point. For us, it was a 3-month process from diagnosis to transplant. And because he was healthy he wasn't healthy, but he was healthy in the sense that he did not need transfusions yet. That was a huge gift. They felt very strong that he would do well because he would be able to handle the chemo associated with the bone marrow transplant, and being that he had a sibling donor that he would engraft fine, and he did. I mean, we had no major side effects or anything or any complications.
Thank you. Christy, did your family consider a second round of ATG before going to transplant?
It was offered to us, and the statistic we were given at the time was that it had only a 60% success rate of curing Haley, and the bone marrow transplant had a 90 to 95% success rate at the time with a sibling match. So we decided the odds were in our favor to go with the transplant. We had tried the ATG, and at that time it was an 80-85% chance. And every time you repeat the treatment, your success rate potentially goes down. And we had shelved the gift of our daughter having a sibling match, and it just seemed like the right time to take advantage of it. In our opinion, God doesn't give you those gifts to not unwrap. We had saved it as long as we could, and it became the only option. And knowing how fortunate we were that it was a sibling, it was very hard to let both children out of our grasp and into the care of someone else, but there really wasn't another option for us. We wanted it to be over as quickly as possible, and if the transplant was successful, that would be the most expedient route, despite the fact that you are in a bubble for nearly 2 years. So we didn't consider repeating ATG.
Thank you. And what did your family do to prepare for the transplant? Jennifer, would you like to start with that one first?
Sure. Well, the first thing we did do, we obviously notified family. We got the schools ready because my son was 13, my daughter was 11. We pulled them both out of physical school at that time. And I do not live in Boston, just so everybody knows. It's 4 hours from where I live. I don't live in Massachusetts. And so we had to go live in Massachusetts in order for our family to be close together. Plus, since my daughter was the donor, she needed to be in the area. And they suggested she can come back home, but we really want our family to be together. But then also, if there was a need for her to be there, if something else was needed from her, that it would be good if she was close by. So we basically notified schools, notified them that basically we didn't know how long, or at least our son was going to be out for. Formed family. Having to explain to family what this was another challenge, because at the time there was not a lot of information out again on pediatric MDS. We did do some fun things that we could do before we went in, because like Christy said, I mean, you live in isolation. I mean, how the world lived during 2020 is how we lived during that time, just by ourselves, isolated, quarantined, basically the whole family, because we didn't want to get sick, because we didn't want to get him sick. And so we did go to a basketball game. We went to a Broadway show before we walked into the hospital. And, we basically said goodbye. Our family and friends had like a little going away party, again, small group, because he couldn't be around a lot of people at that time because his white blood cells were low. So his immune system was low. And a lot of insurance checks. I will say that was a very big one too. I mean, when you're a parent, as I'm sure all of you listening, you're going to do whatever you have to do. I mean, we were like, we got to sell a house, we will sell a house. But again, just made sure we knew as much as we could know, expecting what about the medications, the hospital stay, all these different things. Is what is going to be covered, what is not going to be covered. So at least we were prepared. We didn't want to be in shock. And we just packed up our car and moved. That's what we did.
Thank you, Jennifer. Christy?
We had a lot of lag time in between our first children's visit and transplant. We checked into children's the first time the end of December, like I said, right around Christmas, and transplant didn't take place until July 6th. So we had a long time of living in a bubble of isolation. So for us, it was a blessing because it was just too much to wrap our head around, all of the changes that we needed to have happen in a short amount of time. So we had 6 months to prepare, and we were commuting an hour back and forth from Fort Collins to Denver. I luckily worked for myself, so I quit working at the time, pulled both kids out of school. My husband was in construction, and bringing home any kind of germs or dirt or mold or fungus is extremely dangerous. So he would go to work in the morning, he would come home, strip down in the garage, immediately go up to the shower, put his clothes in the washing machine, and then come down and greet all of us. We started sanitizing everything, including groceries. We started cleaning neurotically. By the time she went to transplant, we had been commuting once a week for blood transfusions. And by the time we went to transplant, we packed up 2 Rubbermaid bins and took them into her hospital room. Luckily, my mother lived in Denver, so our younger daughter could stay with her. Tyler would go to work in the morning, and we had a schedule of either my mother or I would be with Emily during the day. One of us would be with Emily, one of us would be with Haley. Tyler would go to work, and he and I would alternate who slept at the hospital. So we just didn't really have a home base, but it was important for Emily to have a home base, and we had her with my mother. Before we could ever come home, though, when we got discharged, we had to live in a safe house, similar to what Jennifer was talking about having to live in. And before we could even come home, we had to have a lot of construction done on our house because it wasn't safe. We live in a hot climate. It was during the summer. We had a whole house fan that we opened the windows and brought cool air in the evening, and we couldn't do that anymore. So we had to have air conditioning put in. We had a shower that had some mold in it, and it would be the one Haley used, and it was in the grout. So we just tore it all out, and we're fortunate enough that my husband, being in construction, had a lot of connections who were willing to help and volunteer. And that's one message I really want to give to parents, is that as alone and scary as it feels, you're not alone. There are a bajillion people out there who want to help you and they don't know how to help you. And I know it's really hard to delegate what you need, but being able to accept whatever gifts people offer or ask for what you need is going to be a huge benefit to you. And don't be shy about asking or accepting. It's incredibly humbling, but people want to help you. And you can do it. It's a different lifestyle, but we've made it through the pandemic. That was kind of a sneak peek of what life is like, but you can do it because it is your kid and you will do anything it takes to save your kid and get back to normal life as you previously knew it.
And we'll start with Christy on this one. We know what you were told about the benefits of the transplant. What were you told about the risk of transplant? And we'll start with Christy on that one.
Really, the only risk that stuck out in my mind was that our daughter might not be able to have children. And we just kind of had to shrug our shoulders like, okay, well, if we don't have our daughter, we aren't going to have grandchildren anyway. So that was really one long-term effect if it didn't happen, whatever. We knew graft versus host was a huge concern, and even with a sibling match, it's real. We knew the risk of infection was very real. And those were all things, again, because we had 6 months to prepare, we felt like we were in a familiar lay of land and we could keep maintaining what we were doing and batten down the hatches a little bit more. If we had to clean a little bit more, if we, didn't go outside, we altered our activities more. Whatever it took to be safe, get rid of houseplants, get rid of fish and frogs and any kind of pets that we had at the time. The risks, they were terrifying, but the thought of potentially losing our child was more terrifying. So we were willing to accept whatever risks there were at the time. It was scary to think that Emily was only 2. And because Haley's aplastic anemia hadn't gone from severe to very severe, she had such a large deficit in her bone marrow that the doctors couldn't assure us that they would be able to collect enough bone marrow from Emily to provide what Haley needed. And they didn't want to leave Emily deficient, but Haley also needed a ton. So that was scary. Emily had to be subjected to steroid shots in her legs, which was really, really painful and unpleasant. But again, those were the risks that there wasn't an alternative to it. They were part of what you do. So.
Thank you, Christy. Jennifer, how about for you? What were you told about the risk?
Well, we were told again about GVHD, which I guess at the time was probably the scariest thing for us, the graft versus host, organ damage, increased risk of infection because they completely wipe out the entire immune system with the chemo that is done before the transplant, including all his vaccinations they had gotten, all would be gone. So going out or being near people was not safe, which I think is hard for children to hear. And it not grafted, new bone marrow not grafting, it failing. And if it failed, we were told that they'd be able to do a second one. So don't be discouraged. But for us, the GVHD was probably one of the scariest things because like Christy said, even though he had a sibling donor, there's still that risk. And the organ damage. Again, I struggled with these things because he didn't have these problems before. So it was things that honestly I prayed about. It's do we do the transplant? Is it going to cause more problems that he's having now? And I understand they kept assuring me, if you don't do it, it was just a matter of time. but it's hard to make those decisions. His heart is still monitored. I mean, and he has no organ failure. And I thank God for that, and be completely honest. And, but it's still monitored, and the same thing, the chemo can make them sterile. We were given options that we could do to kind of help that. So that's something you can talk about with your physician, those of you that are starting this. But again, you just kind of you outweigh the benefit and the risk. So it's what you do in that situation.
Thank you. While undergoing the transplant in the hospital, do you have some tips for parents, what they can do to help their child stay in the hospital, be less boring? Because it's, I'm sure, very difficult when you're little to be in the hospital for days and sometimes even months. Jennifer, would you like to start with that one first?
Yeah, sure. The first recommendation is make their hospital room as much as like their home as possible. So video games, books, board games, whatever you do, whatever he or she does at home, bring it there. I mean, there was no limit. I mean, stereo was bought, as PlayStation was bought. We bought all kinds of board games. We would send people pictures of us playing board games as a family, and so people would send us more. Even eating dinner as a family, that was something that was important to us. So even though his appetite diminished at times, we took the little table that's in the hospital room and all four of us surrounded it and we ate together. You want to just make it as a normal experience that he or she's already used to, because it's scary. So any type of normalcy kind of takes that edge off. That's what I learned. And walking, I highly recommend walking. One of the things we were also told as a side effect from the chemo is that he may lose mobility just because you get so sick. I mean, you can get so sick, I should say. I shouldn't say you're going to get sick. You can get so sick. And they said walking helps the chemo move and it helps them flush it out. Mm-hmm. So that was something we encouraged him to do. And they actually, nurses got together and got a Fitbit for him, which now encouraged him to walk miles. So it actually helped him to the point where that the chemo, even though it was doing what it needed to do, he was able to get rid of it. And he didn't have those certain side effects that we were told were very likely with the chemo. And conversations with family and friends. I mean, now with the technology we have, you could have the video calls, whether FaceTime or whatever, whatever you would Zoom. Even my daughter, she actually kept in touch with her friends. So let family know. I mean, I told people and friends, please flush us, just send us so many cards. I wanted him to constantly be getting mail so he knew he wasn't forgotten. And let people know that you're welcome to that, because some people don't know how to help, like Christy was saying. And honestly, I didn't know how we needed help either. But once we were there, you just start realizing, I need this, he could use this. And pictures, that was the other thing. We hang up the cards, we had put up pictures. He loved soccer. So he had a picture of his favorite soccer player on the wall. Make it as homey, it's not home, nothing will replace home, but make it as much as like home as possible.
Thank you. Christy, how about you?
Ours was a little different. I love that you guys could eat together. We were not allowed to eat in Haley's room. So meal times were hard because I had to leave. Whoever was with her had to leave the room and go eat in the cafeteria or a different room on the floor. But definitely bringing things of comfort. I mean, Haley was only 5, so of course she had all of her loveys and she had to be in bed a lot, or didn't feel like getting out of bed much. So comfortable clothes, but I made sure that she got up every day and got dressed. Technically she was sick, but it wasn't the kind of sick that she had to be in bed for. So to have a normal daily routine of you wake up and you have breakfast and you get dressed, we both got dressed. You can't sit in your pajamas all day was a big thing for me. Surprisingly, the daily tasks that were required of her each day take a lot of time. So that took up a big chunk of our time. Just waiting for food to come up from the cafeteria takes a while. We couldn't bring anything in. My brother had bought her an iPad, and she was very into playing Smurfs on the iPad. And this was a while ago, so iPads were relatively new, and she did not understand, nor did I realize when I hooked up my credit card to the iPad that she was then ordering like hundreds of dollars worth of Smurf berries. So we quickly put an end to that and then stuck to free games on the iPad. She was very into crafts. We relied heavily on the child life specialist that we had. They are a treasure of people. I mean, child life specialists, in my opinion, are as important as the doctors and nurses. They just know how to handle kids of all ages, and they know what to say and how to say it and what entertainment to bring. And as a parent, you can fall apart on them. And, so we relied on the people there. We became friends with the staff there. And while Haley couldn't have a lot of interaction with her friends, she was able to meet new people that she thought were friends and filled her bucket. Carrying Bridge was a huge component for me. So I was able to just blast out to our support system updates of what was going on, and they could then leave messages in return. And we spent a lot of time reading those messages together. And if Haley wanted to respond, she could type something. The cards that came in kept our spirits up. I had to take care of myself at the time too, and needed breaks from the room. And I needed Haley to know that it was okay to be in her room alone while I went to shower, or I went to eat, or if I went to run on the treadmill at the hospital. So I think keeping your routine as a parent, maybe not the way it is every day, but familiar aspects for you, because as parents, we want to make it all better for our kids. And there are days that are going to be really tough, and they're going to pass very slow, and your kids are going to be pissed off, and their attitudes are going to be horrible. And giving yourself permission to step back and do what you need to do to cool down or take a break, and asking staff and child life specialists to please come in and can you just hold the torch for me for a little bit, because you're not meant to do it alone. And no parent is meant to do what Jennifer and I have done, what you're about to embark on. There's not an easy part of the process, but maintaining a familiar routine from day to day keeps it that much more tangible and relatable in a time when everything in your world is changing. That was our home. You make it your home. You decorate it as much as you can the way they want. And it was hard for me because we got moved from one room to another room several times during our stay, depending on the influx in patients. And that was frustrating because that's your home, for a month or more. And it's hard to have the rug pulled out from under you when, nobody wants to move. So I agree, keeping it as familiar as you can is the best you can do.
Thank you. Jennifer, you spoke a little bit about side effects, and what were you told would be some of the side effects while you were in the hospital, and how were those managed, if there were any?
Well, we were obviously the most common one, I guess most popular one would be hair loss. A lot of vomiting, loss of appetite. So that would mean supplementing nutrition, either through IV or by TPN. Again, losing mobility, sleeping constantly. Those are loss of taste and smell, sensitivity to light. Those are the major ones. And losing your appetite and taste were actually the bigger ones that my son just did not want. So that to him being able to eat through a transplant was very, very important to him. So we did all that we could. Again, did a lot of praying, did a lot that we could do to help manage that. And one of the chemos that he did receive, the chemo, you're on it. Well, for him, I know every case is different. Sometimes like 8 hours a day and 2-hour slots. And one of them, if it sat in his system, could affect his bladder and his liver. And he had to basically get up and go to the bathroom to flush it out. And again, this round of the chemo wiped him out. So again, I set my alarm. I made sure I wake him up, have him go to the bathroom to get it out and he would sometimes fight me on it just because he didn't want to be bothered. He didn't have to go. But all I'm thinking is what could happen if you don't do this? And again, they don't understand all of that. You're fighting for them. And the nurses would come in if they saw I didn't get up yet and remind me, he needs to use the bathroom. So there's some things with the side effects. They happen. You try to manage them best as possible, like the nausea, that's a big one too. But there are things that they have to help. Like they gave my son a patch for the nausea that he had, and that was enough for him. He didn't need anything else to help manage that. But if they tell you that there's something you could do to decrease a side effect, definitely do it. And the other one too is getting the sores in your mouth. Rinse. We were told to constantly have him rinse his mouth, which we did. And he never got that. He never had the sores, which allowed him to eat, which again was his big thing. So because he was able to eat, he had a little more energy than probably what was expected when he was going into transplant.
Thank you. Christy, anything you'd like to add?
As far as side effects, we had a similar side effect with the chemo that Haley was on, in that it could affect her bladder. And we were not told that she would need to be catheterized. So when she and my husband, he was on duty with her, and Haley wasn't having any of it. And she's one that we really needed to level with her. And even though she was 5, we tried to keep everything in perspective in terms that she could understand, because she was the patient and it was her body. And so explaining to her, you need to be catheterized and this is what it is and this is why you need it, she still fought tooth and nail and was like, I'm not doing it. And went nuts in the hospital to the point that the charge nurse said, no, this is tormenting her more. Let's see how she does. And she was on chemo for 4 days straight. So for 96 hours, she had to get up every single hour to go to the bathroom. And sometimes they were pumping IV fluids through to help her. And sometimes she'd get up every 20 minutes. And sometimes she would wet the bed. And finally she decided, I don't want to wet the bed anymore. I will wear a pull-up. But the risk of not getting her up, nobody got sleep for 4 days because we needed to get her to void as regularly as possible. We had a horrible, we found out when she was getting her transfusions, which were at least a weekly occurrence, she was highly allergic to Benadryl. And so they were pre-medding her to prevent any allergic reaction to the blood product, only to find that every reaction was more severe. Every transfusion got worse. At one point, she was practically rabid, foaming at the mouth, speaking in tongues, passed out, and they finally determined it was the Benadryl, which is that wasn't anything that had to do with the transplant. It wasn't a side effect. It was just yet another layer of something we had to deal with. I am not putting that on anyone's radar as something to be expected from these diseases. It happened to us and was just another hurdle to cross. The steroids she was on, prednisone, it made her really, really angry and moody. And just as a parent, it's hard you're already beat down and you don't want to deal with that extra layer of attitude. So as a parent, you want to be hooked up to a tranquilizer just so you can deal with your kid. And you have to say prayers. You have to be patient. You have to, take a break and level with your kid of why you have to do this. You're right. You have to suck on a troche and nobody likes to do it, but these are the side effects that will happen. And this is your body and you are in control of that. But I am doing my best to keep you safe. I can't do any of this for you. And I know you're not hungry. So what sounds good? Oh, a Shirley Temple, fantastic. And the nurses, doctors kept saying she needs to be put on a nutritional supplement. And I was like, let's just wait and see. She's not losing any weight. I understand you're trying to prevent her from losing weight, but taking food away from her by supplementing her nutrition, she's not going to be hungry. And that's just one more decision she can't make for herself. If she isn't hungry for something nutritional, I don't care. Her body is getting calories that sustain her enough to get up and walk around her room, so that when her sister comes, they can build a fort and entertain each other. There's a lot that goes into the psychology of it all and the side effects of the psychology that I think are very important. It's not just the medical side effects of everything that your child is going through and being put in their body. It's the psychological ones and the idea that she was stripped of school, she was stripped of home, she was stripped of anything familiar. If she had the choice to eat something, by all means, mashed potatoes, mac and cheese, and Shirley Temples. That was it. Every day was a special day because she got a Shirley Temple. That kept her spirits up, which I think in turn helped avoid a lot of mental pitfalls that could have taken place.
Thank you. Our next question is siblings, because siblings are also affected and they are an important part of this whole journey. And both of their siblings were their donors. How did you as a family help the siblings with not only dealing with that their brother and sister had an illness, but how did you help them with they were the donor and dealing with the whole process? Jennifer, would you like to start with that one?
Sure. Well, the first thing is being honest. My daughter was 11 at the time, and we had already been going to doctor's appointments and she knew we were going to doctors, but we did not tell her the details of what was happening at that time. But children are smart. She asked me one day in the car, what's going on? And I felt really bad. So we told her what was going on. Her initial reaction was she was scared and very upset because she didn't think things were going to go well for her brother. So at that point, we actually decided to bring her along. That was what we were able to do, but we were able to bring her along to the appointment. So she felt she was part of the process. Family members offer to come and sit with her, however it works for you. And again, every family, every child is different. This is what we did. And when we were told that he needed a bone marrow transplant, she was actually in the room at that time. And immediately she was, I want to be the donor, which I was thinking, I don't want any of this for any of my children. Like now you're involving my other child and, but she was serious. I'm going to be his donor. I want to be his donor to the point that I was concerned. What if she's not a match? I didn't want her to feel horrible, upset, feel guilty, and I just want to say quickly too, is as a mom, I always felt bad that I never saved the cord blood. Just everybody, just get this out there in case you're thinking this. We were told that wouldn't have been an option for his transplant anyway. If any of you are wondering, should I have done that? Wasn't an option. So if you're thinking that, don't worry about that. There's nothing to do. But she was involved. She wanted to be the donor. We were called that she was a match. She was excited. She had her own set of appointments after that point where, again, because my daughter was 11. So she was prepped. There were some meetings that she had a conference with the social workers we were not allowed to be in because they wanted to make sure she was fully aware of what she was about to do and that she was willing. they even said to us, if she's not willing, what will you do? And we said, we'll get another donor. I mean, it's a hard thing here. I mean, we want our son, of course, to live, but we're not going to force something on our daughter because now she's also becoming a patient at a different level. And from there, we just were very honest with her. We involved everybody, both of them in the conversations. It actually brought them closer together. I'll be honest. We noticed they started doing more together, and they were close at that time anyway, but there was, I guess, a special bond between them. And I think she felt this desire to really watch out for her brother, take care of him. But then he seemed like he wanted to make sure she was okay, that he was okay. So I would say honesty is the best thing to do, and let the sibling know that they are special, because majority of my time obviously did go to my son, but I made sure we had our special moments together, things that she liked to do, and she valued that time. And every day the hospital we were at had a garden, and she loves being outside. So we would go there, we would go for walks, just do all that you can to make sure that the other child knows that they're not forgotten, they are special, they are appreciated. And if family offers to take them away or do something, it's hard. For me, it was hard at first, but you do it because your child needs it. They just need to have all attention on them for a little bit. I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Jennifer. Christy?
In our case, Emily was so young, she didn't have really a clue what was being asked of her, and we did have to weigh whether or not Emily was going to be okay with it. And it's really awesome to know all these years later, the person that Emily has become, that she gladly would have done it. I think she would have been a lot like Jennifer's daughter. So it's really cool to think that. It was important that both children felt loved and stable and had consistent environments, and we leveled with both of them as much as you can with a 2 and a 5-year-old. And they've always been really close. It did bring them closer. To this day, they're best friends, without a doubt. The hardest part was when they couldn't see each other, and there were times where it just wasn't safe for them to see one another. And I mean, Haley would cry, "I just want my Emily." And you try to keep the siblings as connected as possible. You try to, like Jennifer said, make both of them feel special, because yes, it is about one child, but again, the psychological component of the other, they can't be forgotten. They are still an integral and important part to your family. And I would say I'd be surprised if there are family members that don't want to help their siblings, that is. I don't think I'm answering this question very well.
No, you're doing great.
Haley had beads of courage. And so the child life specialist then started a kind of fake beads of courage for Emily before the transplant, just to be a supportive sibling. And that brought a lot of buy-in for Emily. And if Emily could come to the hospital, she felt like she was included. She thought the hospital was Disneyland, because Haley always came home with gifts, and she got spoiled too when on the day of transplant, she wanted to spend the night in the hospital because she thought it was like an all-night party. And I was more comfortable because she had received a blood transfusion, and I just, for one night, wanted all 4 of us under one roof, even though we were in different sections of the hospital. And it became evident Emily, she was never going to go to sleep. Nobody on that floor was going to get any sleep. So we had to leave and go to grandma's house. And I think you have to cater to your kids in these unique situations the way you would at any other time. There are times in life where it's really exciting for one child that they are getting their driver's license, or they're going to college, or they've, got a really cool award at school, and the other sibling kind of takes the back seat for the moment, but then they have their moment to shine as well. It's just a balancing act, and it's a balancing act without being in the hospital.
Thanks, Christy. And tell us, how are your kids doing today? Jennifer, you would like to start with that?
Yeah, my kids are doing great. My son is now 21. It's been 7 years since his transplant. He is fine. He's great. He's healthy. People, when he shares a story, or if we share a story, but not his story, really to just share, even in college, people cannot believe that is what he went through. And he's very open about it. I mean, because now that he's older, he realizes what he went through and the things how it affected him. I think he talks more about it now than he did then. I just think because he was in survival mode at the time and didn't really realize all that he had gone through as well as given up. And my daughter is 19. And she's happy and wants to donate bone marrow again. I'll be honest, like to her, that's just what she wants to do. And she's a blood donor because she just wants to help people. So they're both good, both in college and happy and healthy.
Thank you. And Jennifer, your family is very much about giving back to the bone marrow failure community. And how else are you giving back?
So when we came home, I realized how alone I felt alone, just being that nobody knew what we had been through, I guess. I wanted to connect with other families that had went through what Amita went through with mild dysplastic syndrome. And I started a Facebook. I wasn't even on Facebook. So I joined Facebook to make a Facebook page to see if I can find other families. And I met a couple. And Dr. Hoffman, again, was the main doctor for my son. We co-founded a foundation called Global Pediatric Mild Dysplastic Syndrome. Global Pediatric, saying it all wrong. Sorry. Global Pediatric Incentive. And it's basically a nonprofit organization that's committed to the research as well as the education for families that have children with pediatric mild dysplastic syndrome. And then also a community for physicians where they can share information. So all the children can basically receive the same fair chance at treatment, because every hospital is different. I mean, there are some hospitals, in our experience anyway, that were like, they're not familiar with it. So they recommend that you do go somewhere else. So we started that foundation. You can find them at pediatricmds.org. There is a fact sheet right now there for information. And also there's a handbook in the works. And there's also a closed group on Facebook called Families of Pediatric MDS. If you want to connect with other families, it's always new, sadly, but always new families coming on. There are families that are 7 years out, like we are, some are 10 and 15, and some that are currently going through transplant, some that are within the year. There's always somebody to connect with. And if you're not on Facebook, you can contact somebody through pediatricmds.org. Just email there, and Dr. Hoffman or I will be very happy to refer a family to you if you do want to connect with somebody.
Thanks, Jennifer. And Christy, how are your kids doing, and how have you found a way to give back to family and help other families?
Both girls are doing great. Emily is in 8th grade. Haley's a junior in high school. Transplant was 10 years ago this summer. We call it Sisters Day, and they're both doing great because they were so young and remember so little of it, if any. It was important to me that they knew their story, and I wrote a book and just published it this spring called Pink Elephants. The book is their story, and from my perspective, it's Pink Elephants, a mother's story of faith, strength, and perseverance. And the whole point of it was, one, to give them the story of what they've been through, and two, to help others and say, this is what happened to us and this is how we handled it. It's not a how-to or step-by-step manual by any means. It's just a this is our story. This is how we handled our experience, and hopefully give people the reminder that they are stronger than they think they are, and that you can handle what you're given. It's not what you want to handle, but you can handle what you're given, and that you are not alone. Everybody has some sort of trauma, and while these diseases are rare, there is strength in numbers as far as empathy goes. Somebody else is going through a difficult time as well, and as I said before, everyone wants to help one another. Nobody wants to see each other in pain or suffering, especially when it comes to children. And Caring Bridge was huge for us. So, and Beads of Courage and Make a Wish. So some of the proceeds of my book go to those three organizations. They go to AAMDS because they were our resource and lifeline to being able to relate and get actual, factual, tangible information. And I think it's important to donate blood and to be on a national registry for organ and tissue donation, because in my mind, if I have something that I can share with someone else that's going to enrich their life, and at the same time, I get the bonus of having my life enriched, why wouldn't I? I mean, if I have blood to spare, if I have, I don't want to belittle organ donation, but if I have a kidney that someone else needs and I am the only solution, by all means, please, I raise my hand. So I think it's important to pay it forward.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jennifer and Christy, for sharing your time this afternoon, sharing your family's very personal stories, to be such a help to other patients and families who are starting on their journey, or in the midst of treatment. So thank you so much. We really do truly appreciate everything. And if you'd like to watch this webinar again at a later time, it is going to be archived to our website within 2 to 3 business days. If you have any additional questions or anything that we are able to help out with, you can send your questions or anything that you need to us in 3 ways. You can send us an email to help@aamds.org, call our helpline at 800-747-2820, or submit your question to our Facebook page. On behalf of the Aplastic Anemia and MDS International Foundation, thank you for joining us today and making us your resource of choice for information on bone marrow failure diseases. Our medical advisory board and team are always here to support you and your family, as we have done for the past 37 years. This concludes our program. Thank you so much, Jennifer and Christy. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. If there is one more thing I can say, if anyone's interested, the book is available on Amazon. It is Pink Elephants, A Mother's Story of Faith, Strength, and Perseverance. And if you read it, I really hope that it helps you.